Hello and welcome to Series 3 of Crisis What Crisis, a podcast designed to be a useful field guide as we all try to navigate and continue to come to terms with a dramatically changed world. Whether personal, professional or both, crisis is without doubt the new shared experience. I'm Andy Coulson, a former newspaper editor, Downing Street Director of Communications and one-time inmate of HMP Belmarsh. For the last 5 years, I've put all of my experience, the good and the bad, to use as a strategic advisor to business leaders. And I can tell you the bad has been just as useful as the good. And that got me thinking as the first lockdown began that there are plenty of great podcasts out there where you can hear stories of success, but there are far fewer where you can benefit from the experience of those whose lives have properly unraveled. So in Crisis What Crisis, I talk to the embattled, shamed, courageous, ruined, damaged, resilient, unlucky and lucky survivors of crisis. Some names will be familiar, some less so. Our guests share their experiences, though, with honesty, often with humour, but always in the hope that they might be useful to anyone facing down their own demons and challenges. Put simply, these are crisis conversations worth sharing. Stay tuned at the end of the episode when I'll give my thoughts and takeaways, the lessons, if you like, for when life unravels. And if you enjoy the podcast, please do subscribe and give us a rating and a review. It really helps make sure these stories reach an even wider audience of people who may find them useful. And that, in the end, is what it's all about. Crisis What Crisis is generously supported by Mindstream, a brilliant company who harness the power of music for personal well-being, whether it be music for meditation, to help focus, sleep, stress relief, yoga and fitness, rejuvenation, even grief and loss. Mindstream is there to improve human performance. I've tried it, it works, and I'd recommend having a listen to the Mindstream catalogue yourself. Just search Mindstream, that's mind with a Y, on Spotify. Thanks again for joining me. I'm delighted that my guest today is someone who can talk not just about what it is to personally face down a life-threatening crisis, but who's worked at the epicentre of crises that have affected us all. Mark, now Lord Sedwill, was the Cabinet Secretary from 2018 to last year, Britain's most senior civil servant. To quote from the musical Hamilton, he is the man who was in the room when it happened, a man who worked at the right hand of two prime ministers as they navigated crises, including Brexit, the Salisbury poisonings, and of course the COVID-19 pandemic. These were not the first moments of drama in the life of public service for our guest. In previous jobs, he's been threatened at gunpoint by Saddam Hussein's henchmen, and whilst working as Deputy High Commissioner in Pakistan, had a bomb planted under his seat. Mark Sedwill is the embodiment of that calm, unflappable public servant that is uniquely British and characteristically understated. Mark, Lord Sedwill, thank you for joining us today. How are you?
Andy, I'm in great form, thank you, and good to be here with you. Nice to have the opportunity to talk.
Well, it's great to see you. Mark, we're talking as the lockdown continues, and on a day, in fact, that a pretty startling piece of crisis management, seemingly from Number 10, has been heavily briefed. This idea that a breach of quarantine rules may carry a 10-year prison sentence. Now, it's an eye-catching idea which strikes me as being utterly, completely bonkers. But I wonder what your reaction was when you read it over the cornflakes this morning.
I was surprised because it sort of came at me out of the blue, and I'm with Lord Sumption, who wrote a column about it this morning on the merits of it. I think the broader lesson about crises and crisis management is just how important it is to stay calm and keep steady in crises and not overreact to events as they arise. And this looks to me like it might fall into that category.
Yeah. I mean, I remember a number of occasions in Number 10 when someone on the political side of the room would chuck in something, kind of along these lines. And those on the civil service side would, to be fair, keep a straight face. But their eyes told you that they were thinking, please, God, make them stop. Now, I don't expect you to name names, of course, but does that kind of resonate? That occasionally the system that we have, will throw up these moments, right?
Yeah, and in a way, that's part of the strength of the system, because crises are always something where you're having to be adaptable. You're almost by definition, no matter how well practiced you are, how many crises you faced, acute, chronic, whatever, You're dealing with something new and unexpected. And so having that tension where there are some wild ideas, and by the way, they're not always wild ideas from the political side of the table. Professionals and civil servants can come up with a few on their own account. But having that tension, ensuring that there is always someone in the room who feels confident enough to say, actually, no, that's crackers. We won't do that. I think is an important way of reacting to it. It is important to ensure a prime minister or whoever's in charge is exposed to as wide a range of ideas and inputs as possible as they navigate through it. Because simply sticking to the traditional script or traditional playbook might not be enough.
Yeah, I'd like
and in some crises has proved not to be.
Very good. Yeah, I'd like to talk a little bit more about that, because I think a little bit later in the conversation, around that idea that you've got to allow people to get it wrong, quite aside from coming up from the unusual idea, but also that they have the courage to get it wrong. I'd like to start though by talking about the sort of process of crisis management at the highest level where you've operated so effectively. And there is this idea, isn't there, that inside government, outside of government, there's this idea that inside, behind the door, there's an operations room with a systems driven by an all-seeing, all-knowing, complex algorithm that a switch is flicked in times of national crisis. When in fact, crisis management in number 10 is a fundamentally human process. That it's a group of people in a room, often armed with incomplete and sometimes incorrect information, all trying to do their best, invariably with constant incoming from the media and political opponents. It's a messy process. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember listening to a World War II general once being interviewed about how you operate on the battlefield. And he said, I didn't expect him to say this. The first thing he said was, well, you spend much of your time trying to figure out where everyone is. So in any situation, one's dealing with incomplete, inaccurate information, as you said, and trying to look through, in the modern era, a massive information to really identify what is going on. As you say, it's fundamentally a human endeavor. We train people in crisis management. There are procedures. There is that room, the Cobra suite and so on. But fundamentally, in the end, it's still getting a group of people around a table with a decision maker in the chair and that human activity of figuring out what's going on and what the right response is.
What can you tell us about the sort of, because you get that training, as you mentioned, there are, there's a kind of well exercised muscle in government around crisis to an extent in terms of process. But what was your sort of personal approach? When you were, at the top of that, it's a horrible expression, but when you're at the top of that decision-making tree with the Prime Minister, what sort of state of mind have you got? What approach did you take to it?
So it partly depends on what position you're in. If you're chairing a meeting, as I often was, then sometimes I'm actually trying to drive energy into the meeting and keep people really focused. If you're sitting to the side of the Prime Minister, often the job is to try and keep everyone calm, stop people moving straight to decisions before all the information has been put on the table. The professionals have had their say. All of the options have been canvassed. And I think probably I always saw my job as just, in some ways, slowing us down slightly in the moment, just in order to try and get to the right decision and then be more confident that that decision would stick. Sometimes you have to go slowly to go fast.
Yeah. And you've got the added complication, obviously, of politics, not to state the absolute obvious, but quite often the decision-making process is loaded down with other considerations that in any other world are kind of relegated. How did you manage that? Clearly, the line is drawn very clearly, right? That is not for you. That is not the job. But there's just a reality, isn't there? Because it's a human process of having to continually kind of make sure that balance is in the right place. I mean, a fascinating challenge in one regard. Would you place it in the fascinating box, or would you place it in the kind of actually at times pretty irritating box?
Closer to the fascinating end rather than irritating. I mean, it's just a fact of life. We're making decisions in a political environment. And I think the thing that people often don't understand outside government is just how non-party political those decisions are. So the kind of reaction that a prime minister will have in the circumstances of a crisis is essentially detached from whether they're a Labour prime minister or coalition or Tory prime minister, much more based on the personality of the individual concerned, and that's true of anyone who's in the lead in a crisis, and handling all of the same pressures. It's why former Home Secretaries, former Prime Ministers, notwithstanding the party political affiliations, often have an empathy for each other and often ask each other's advice because they've all been in those situations. Yes. So the political environment is undoubtedly an important part of the context in which we're operating. But the fact it's political doesn't really mean that the nature of the party in government is actually a factor in most of the crises that I've dealt with.
Yeah, it can occasionally get in the way, of course, but you're right, and certainly with the pandemic, that's the sort of national effort has been clear. The pandemic, I suppose, has in a way kind of exposed the truth of that crisis management as we've just described it, that it's that human process and therefore it's imperfect, and the frailties of that were perhaps best demonstrated when the Prime Minister was, of course, in intensive care, and so many of his senior team, you included, Mark, were diagnosed with COVID. If the film is ever made of this crisis, then that will certainly be one of the key scenes. It's easy to forget the impact of those days. There's visceral drama, across the country and beyond, of course. How do you reflect on them now?
I was lucky. I had a pretty mild bout of it, and therefore, although I was isolating, was able via Zoom and Teams and the other means to carry on operating while I was unwell. Actually, one of the parts of the system that did work well, and it was something we developed in the national security area, was being able to support Dominic Raab as First Secretary as he stepped up to cover the Prime Minister's duties for COVID. And in national security, you have to be able to do that because the Prime Minister might simply be out of contact if a crisis is developing, a terrorist attack or, of course, the nuclear command chain and so on. There must always be continuity in that. And so essentially we just took those principles and applied them to the different circumstances of COVID. And the machine clicked in smoothly behind the First Secretary, Dominic Raab, who had been nominated by the Prime Minister to step in for him should he be indisposed by the illness, which by that stage, of course, he'd had for a couple of weeks or so. So in a sense, that was, although it was a really nasty moment when he went into intensive care, and at a human level, we were all worried about him and the impact on his family and so on. Actually, the system was one of the periods during COVID when the system knew exactly what to do next.
Yeah. How did you manage the human side of it, though? Given that you're all, basically, staring at your computers and no ability to really be in the room together. All the usual ways by which you would try and keep people calm and either actually or metaphorically be wrapping an arm around them. How did you manage that bit?
I think one of the things that you always do in a crisis, and when I talk to courses about crisis leadership, I tell them that leadership in a crisis is like leadership at any other time. You've just got to do more of everything. So you have to be even calmer. You have to communicate even more. You have to you just be prepared to slow down a bit and make sure you've had all the inputs before you make a decision. But once you've made a decision, that's it. You've got to then just get on and implement it and the argument stops. And so at a human level, around that period, it was really those kind of principles that certainly I applied. So we pulled the whole cabinet together, again, virtually, and just told them what the situation was, what the arrangements were for supporting the Prime Minister and for maintaining the continuity of government. And I think people find, at a human level, just that confidence that the machinery is working gives them some confidence and helps people stay calm and keep their heads and make the right decisions. And certainly on my mind, right through that crisis, as through others, some developing faster and more acute than COVID was, but really at that particularly difficult moment when the PM went into intensive care, was how just to try and ensure, using all of those kind of techniques, one just kept everybody steady. And to be fair, everyone stepped up and responded accordingly.
We had Johnny Mercer on the podcast previously, and he was saying a similar thing, really, but in the environment of warfare, that courage is courageous. I mean, is that a sort of related point that demonstrating to your team that that you're continuing to function and work, and that the system is continuing to work, carries its own value, that in itself can be contagious? Wrong word to use in the context of a pandemic, I'll grant you.
Yeah, and that is exactly right. And indeed, it helps you as well. So by forcing oneself to stay calm and to demonstrate that to the team, you're helping them be calm and helping them actually operate more effectively, more intelligently, with an ability to consider. If you're racing around, shouting and looking like you're in a panic, you actually make everyone around you less effective. The reverse is true. If you deliberately project calm, confidence, assurance, then you make everyone else around you operate better, more intelligently, more thoughtfully. Yes. That in itself helps you, as the person in the center of it, actually maintain the real calm. So there's something here about almost the theatre turning into the reality. If you can project calm, no matter how anxious you're feeling, actually you will, in the end, stay calm yourself.
And that extends to the sort of written word as well, which obviously is very important in the political process, very important in Whitehall. So much communication is written. I've always held to the view that if you use the language of crisis, if you start talking about firestorms, indeed if you start talking about crisis almost at times, you almost elevate it to that level. Do you take the same view? Do you take that same kind of approach with the written word as you do with in a meeting or on a Zoom call as it was?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, Andy. And sometimes people like me can be accused of being too dispassionate and deliberately choosing unemotive language in a crisis, but in other circumstances too, to describe situations that are highly emotional. And so whether one's dealing with an acute attack like Salisbury, which was outrageous, and one quickly runs out of adjectives to describe actually what I was feeling during that period, but in communicating, always trying to sound dispassionate, trying to remain professional, means that we're likely to make better decisions that we don't regret later.
With with COVID, obviously there's going to be a public inquiry at some stage that will that will kind of pick over the detail, and the lessons will be learned. But when you reflect on the very early stages of it, how were you able to prioritise? Clearly, the NHS was keeping the NHS operating at the level that it needed to operate has been the core of the whole challenge. But so many different issues attached, affecting every aspect of our lives. Just give us an idea of how you approached that challenge, because it's of a different order to anything certainly that I ever dealt with in politics. Yeah. So the most people have ever dealt with.
Absolutely right. And as you say, there was enormous pressure, particularly on the health system, not just the NHS, but the rest of the health and social care system as well. I think the thing that guided me through that phase is to remember that government, and particularly government in crisis, is a team sport. And so what was my role? And what were the roles of other people? And one of the things, as you know, it's tempting to do at the centre, particularly under the pressure of a crisis with acute public anxiety of the kind that we saw during COVID or in one or two other circumstances, is the tendency to try to play every position on the pitch and centralise every decision.
Yes.
And bring everything into the centre and have the professionals sitting in the Cobra suite for half the day, explaining to ministers what it is they're doing and so on, rather than actually getting on with the job.
Yes.
And so part of my job was to really make sure that we distributed the responsibilities properly. We had the right decision-making and other mechanisms, information mechanisms in place, so that it was sort of a Heineken test. You want to reach the parts that others can't. So can you be sure that the Prime Minister is only having to do the things that only he can do, and has all of the information, etc., and advice that he needs in order to do those things and make those really big decisions? What can be delegated to the Health Secretary? What can be delegated to the Foreign Secretary? What can be delegated to the Home Secretary, etc., and left to them with obviously information flows, but left to them to decide what is going to be left to people with operational responsibility in the NHS, Chief Executive of the NHS, the Chief Scientific Advisor, the Chief Medical Officer, public health officials, and so on. And getting those arrangements right. I mean, this is very much based on essentially a military kind of structure and experience, but being really clear about levels of authority, where decisions are going to be taken, whose job is to do what, whilst then ensuring as well alongside that, information is all being shared so everyone understands what's going on, even if the decisions are distributed, was a big part of what I was trying to do, just to get that system operating properly, rather than trying to, as I say, chase around after the ball. John Reid, the former Labour Home Secretary, Defence Secretary, etc., used to call it 5-year-old football, where everyone runs around after the ball. And it's a pretty good analogy. Government can be quite like that.
Yeah.
And what you have to do is force everyone, like a decent team in any sport, to hold their position and recognise everyone has a different role to play, and they've got to have confidence in everyone else on the team.
Yeah, he was a politician who was good in a crisis, and I say that from I say that from the media, and I didn't work for him in politics. There's also the sort of danger of ego, isn't there? And again, I'm not asking for we're not in the business of naming names, but a crisis often attracts those ego-related problems. There's the kind of, as you've just described, there are those people who will think a crisis is an opportunity for them to demonstrate their brilliance in every regard, and that they'll get their fingers into every part of the pie. And then, of course, there are also people who are utterly terrified of getting something wrong because of they sort of live in fear of what it will mean, either for them, for a politician publicly, or for a civil servant in terms of their career. So there's that kind of perfectly understandable but potentially very damaging kind of ego, kind of human piece in the middle of it. How did you deal with that? I mean, are you blunt about that aspect? Stay out? Or why aren't you getting involved? Or is it a much more subtle process?
It can be both. There are times for bluntness, and certainly there will have been occasions during COVID. I can think of a few examples where, looking back, I was probably much blunter than people might have expected, just in order, because I felt it was necessary to impose some discipline or structure on a situation that, as you know, under pressure can quickly run into or essentially run out of control.
Yeah.
And the other factor you have to keep in mind is the different personality types. As you said, ego comes into it, of course, but also you have extrovert and introvert personalities. And often what one really needs to do is create the space for those people who are quieter, more reflective, don't like making instant decisions, to have just a moment to think and to ensure that their contribution is brought into whatever discussion there is.
Yeah.
You're not learning if you're talking. You're only learning if you're listening. And there is always a risk in government generally, but under the pressure of a crisis when decisions are having to be taken quickly, that the loudest voices in the room are those that carry the day. And part of my job was always to try and ensure that the quieter voices in the room, who might take a little more time expressing themselves and express themselves in less vivid terms, had their opportunity to give their perspective and insight. And I think that, again, is something one should always try to remember in a crisis, that actually it might well be the quietest voice in the room who has the most important point to make.
One of the comms challenges, of course, which is the bit that I am interested in, was that balance between political and scientific leadership. Churchill talked about the need to get scientists, or to keep your scientists on tap, not on top. A phrase I rather like. The PM, though, seemed to take a different view from a communications point of view. He clearly took the decision that science should take the lead, not just in terms of the kind of policy decisions, but in terms of the shop window. Where are you on that?
Well, I think, like you, I remember Churchill's phrase. And of course, by the way, that should be true of every professional. It's not just scientists. But if you're the political leader, then all of the professional expertise, whether it's scientists or military or civil servants or whatever, economists, you name it, should be on tap and not on top. And in the end, the politicians have to make the judgments and balance off all the various risks and issues. And I think this Prime Minister was conscious of that right the way through this. I think if you actually look at it, although there's been this phrase of following the science, of course, the science isn't a single point. There are different views even among the scientists. But it probably, given the nature of this crisis, a pandemic, a public health crisis of this kind, and the confidence the public have in listening to the frontline professionals in these circumstances, just as in a terrorist attack, it's actually the senior police officers who tend to be up front in the media explaining exactly what's going on the ground and in the investigation, rather than a minister. I think that distribution of communications responsibilities is right. And so if you think of a terrorist attack, you have the police on the ground, as I said, will be explaining it, or as they did in Salisbury, explaining what's going on operationally. But the policy and political implications are then for ministers to explain, either in a press conference or in Parliament. And in COVID, I think generally that blend has also been there. We haven't, for example, had economists out explaining the government's economic policy. That's been the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, and so on, because those are inherently political matters. But the operational issues around health, I think it was right to have the Chief Medical Officer, Chief Scientific Advisor, Chief Executive of the NHS, doctors, professors, etc., out explaining to the public, because they carry authority and credibility with the public and know what they're talking about.
I totally agree with the idea of having those voices out there, but for a period, at least quite a long period, it was more than that, though. They were very much, as I say, in the shop window. They were at the lectern, and as in the early days, given equal, if not frankly, sort of priority status over the Prime Minister's own messaging. You felt that was the right thing, though, or would you say, with the benefit of hindsight, which is of course the easiest thing in the world, that with the benefit of hindsight, that balance wasn't in those early days of the crisis necessarily right?
I'm not sure. I don't think it was government's intention or indeed the Prime Minister's, let alone the professionals' intention, for the balance to come out that way. It was always, those press conferences always had the Prime Minister or the Health Secretary or another minister in the central position, leading the press conference, taking and distributing the questions and so on. And certainly the experts alongside, whether it was Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance or their various deputies and colleagues, always saw themselves in a supporting role. Yeah. I think inevitably the media, particularly the broadcast media, tilted the balance because in the public mind, because it's really interesting and unusual for people to hear from someone like Chris Whitty, who, until the pandemic, had always maintained a low public profile.
The sort of disease of the don't know, a politician's reluctance to use the words, I don't know the answer to a question. Did you sort of, was that an issue in those early days? Because an armchair critic, again, one of the easiest jobs in the world, by the way, but an armchair critic would say that we, too often, rather than saying I don't know, we rushed government rushed to give an answer that turned out to be a blind alley, or turned out to be an answer that was entirely the wrong direction, when the right answer should have been we don't know yet. That rush to kind of wanting to present, an aura of certainty around everything. Did you recognise that? Do you agree? Do you think that that's a problem within politics?
There's always great pressure there, and I think it is hard for someone to say I don't know in circumstances where the key objective is to communicate confidence to the public and to try and ensure that the public behave in a particular way, whether that's to comply with the restrictions of the lockdown in the COVID case, or if you think of a national security incident, perhaps to stay calm and stay indoors, whatever it might be. And so I think I would prefer that we had a mechanism by which it was possible to communicate the levels of uncertainty that we're dealing with without sort of saying, I just don't know what's going on, but to communicate the levels of uncertainty without that becoming a political football. And I don't think that's entirely the responsibility of the politicians, by the way, because you've been operating both sides of the line in the media. You know how that can be interpreted if the media want to be hostile about it. So I think there is something to be said for communicating the degree of uncertainty, the fact that one is operating in the fog of events. But remembering that in the end, the purpose of communication isn't simply to inform, it is also in a crisis to try and affect behavior, whether it is to get people to come forward with information, to lie low and stay out of harm's way, or to comply with a series of instructions on a lockdown. And so you've got to ask yourself about the effect of the communication on behavior, not just whether people, and in particular the media and the political correspondents especially, feel that they feel well informed.
No, I agree completely. It is certainly a two-sided coin in the way that you describe, but you might also argue that the way to get to the behavioural change, if you like, is through consistency and through building a relationship of kind of trust, between politician and public. And
yeah, I agree with that.
That's about authenticity. And authenticity, the authentic answer
I agree
can't be every time, but can more frequently than it is be I don't know. It's a very
without necessarily just just saying I don't know. But I think actually that was part of the reason for having the scientists alongside. They did communicate the range of uncertainty in the assessments that they were making. They were always very careful to say, here is what the evidence says so far.
Yeah.
And some of that was lost in translation as it was summarized and communicated through to the public. But that was part of the reason for having the scientists there, was to let people know essentially these were judgments that were being made on the basis of the best evidence and insight and expertise available, but that we were learning more and more about the nature of the virus and so on as we were tackling the pandemic. And I think that was one of the benefits of having the scientists alongside, even though, as you say, sometimes the same tone is difficult for a politician to take.
Yeah. We've talked about your approach. You've seen so many, senior politicians, prime ministers included, up close. You've been at their side as they've operated in crisis. What are the characteristics, in your view, that make, at that level of politics, a great crisis manager?
People who are good at the big picture and who stay calm. So I think that's true of any crisis manager, by the way. But of course, at the very top level, it's going to be a politician, a very senior politician. And one of the things that the system needs from political leaders is to remain that sort of connection to the big picture, that it isn't just about managing the immediate crisis, it's managing the immediate crisis in the context of whatever the political priorities are at the time. And so a politician who can remain political and doesn't simply try to become a super official or a super crisis manager is really important. One who stays calm, who's able to ensure that people around them are genuinely giving them the real advice and insight, and who's willing to have difficult things said to them and unwelcome truths spoken to power, etc. Those kind of capabilities, good listener, calm, focused on the big picture, makes a good crisis manager, and of course, only more so at the political level. That's
an interesting point. The ability to allow people to speak truth to power when you're the power. With the two prime ministers that you've worked with, that was the environment, you would say?
We always tried to make sure that it was, and to be fair to both of them, and indeed, actually, I mean, I've worked closely with, not as closely, but closely with previous prime ministers as well, or been close up to them, actually under the real pressure of crises, whether it was the financial crisis back in 2008. I was private secretary to the foreign secretary on 9/11, and therefore was in a lot of the key meetings with Tony Blair around that time and the Iraq War. Heavily involved, as you'll recall from your own time, in a range of the national security issues that David Cameron faced. So, I've served under 7, but of the 5 prime ministers I've seen close up, I think all of them actually, in their very different ways, with their very different personalities, operated pretty well in a crisis. And that's when you sort of saw the sort of the underlying strengths that it takes to get to that job come out.
Let's talk about another crisis that landed in your lap. You touched on it earlier, March 2018 and the Salisbury poisonings, a crisis that has, of course, been made into a TV drama, the stuff of a spy novel. What can you tell us about the process on the inside of that crisis? Because you won't, I know, want to talk about all the work that that you've done in and around the world of intelligence quite reasonably, but you were also national security advisor, and this situation came with a very, very significant big picture security risk, alongside the fear that hundreds of people could be directly affected, could be directly poisoned. How did you approach that one, Mark?
I think there were 2 big issues that we were dealing with throughout that. The first was just the operational and practical challenges of the use of a nerve agent, and actually, to their enormous credit, the emergency services in Salisbury responded with great speed, professionalism, very calm throughout that, and kept the public safe. And things could have been an awful lot worse had they not done so. And although the effects of that attack were appalling on, obviously, the people concerned, notably, of course, those who were affected by the Novichok itself, including Dawn Sturgis, who sadly lost her life. Actually, it could have been a great deal worse, and they reacted really well. The other thing that was striking about that was that we were able, in the investigation, to apply a range of techniques that essentially had been developed by the counter-terrorist effort in policing the intelligence agencies and so on. And by treating it that way, we were able to develop quickly a good picture of exactly what had happened. And then, of course, it became apparent that it was an act of a hostile state, the Russians, in that case. And so there was that set of issues and just managing that, really. But to be honest, the professionals in that area were so well practiced. We dealt with so many terrorist attacks. The community knew each other. Although it was a different kind of attack, the relationships were there, the confidence was there. And actually, my job in many ways was relatively straightforward. It was convening the meetings and just making sure everything was happening in good order. And the police in particular, and those doing the investigation, had the time, the space, the resources they needed, and actually kept everybody else off their backs to let them get on with it.
Sorry to interrupt. I used the word understated earlier, and I think you've just given us an example. So we've got two situations here. All right, you're the man in the room. You're the first person, probably maybe one of the first people to be told two things. First, our Prime Minister's in intensive care. That is a proper moment that we've discussed and how you handled it. In this case, what you're being told is the Russians did it. And that is a by any measure, wherever you place that moment in sort of history, that is a very, very significant moment. What I'm interested in is how did you react? Yes, there's the process and the systems. I totally understand it, but how did that, especially given your knowledge and history and expertise in the world of security, hugely significant moment. How did you react to it?
I think you'll find a lot of people who've been in similar situations to the ones I've been in. And if you interview people, particularly in the military, but also others who've been in frontline situations, is you actually act in quite a detached way. And the emotional impact, in a way, tends to strike you later and in the quieter moments at the end of the day, when you've left everyone behind and you're in my case back in the flat in London, just trying to decompress a bit at the end of the day. In the moment, the professional training, the fact that you've been through lots of different things before kicks in. You just kind of get on with it. And certainly what I've found, and it's something I discovered about myself quite young, is I react by going hyper rational in these circumstances. That's just my emotional reaction, and it's happened to me when I've been injured, for example. I just go, in a sports accident or something like that. I become quite detached, analytical, and sort of hyper rational. And so, actually, in the moment, I don't feel the pressure of events. At the time, it's right. Okay, what are we going to do? What's happening? Have we got everyone we need? Let's make sure we've structured this in a way to be able to make the right decisions. Think about the wider implications. Tell ministers what they need to know when they need to know it. All of that kind of thing.
But there's adrenaline,
and the emotional impact happens later.
But there's adrenaline, surely. Yeah,
there is. But in my case, the adrenaline tends to cause me to, as I say, go super calm. Rather than raising my emotional level. So people who've seen me in those situations would recognise that.
Where did that come from then, Mark? Where's that kind of?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not even sure it's an ability. I think it's just a reaction. And of course, it means sometimes that you can underreact. That you can find that you're bringing all of your sort of intellect and experience to bear when everyone else involved is reacting emotionally, and therefore you can sometimes get it wrong.
So there have been moments when you thought to yourself, "I should have been more emotional." Can you give us an example?
I think not necessarily more emotional, probably more empathetic. To the way others were feeling about something, rather than just getting my teeth into what needed to be done next. And I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but I would probably recognise it if someone else quoted one at me.
Can you identify your first crisis? There are a couple that I want to talk about in a second that were sort of later in your career. One quite early in your career. But do you remember your first what you would
Yeah,
consider to have been your first crisis?
Yeah, I was the first professional one anyway. I was on my first posting in Egypt back in the early 90s. And we had some British tourists were down in Luxor on a tourist bus, just visiting the historic monuments down there. And that bus was attacked by gunmen who were essentially an insurgent terrorist group, Islamist group in that area, actually a precursor of Al-Qaeda, associated with Ayman al-Zawahiri, who then, of course, became the head of Al-Qaeda after Osama bin Laden's death many years later. But that was a group who were active in Egypt, and some British terrorists were killed. And it wasn't my job particularly. I wasn't doing a consular job, but I went down to Luxor. Immediately, the incident became aware of the incident at the embassy. In order to be essentially the point person on the ground. I was a pretty junior officer at the time, and we just needed somebody on the ground to essentially be the liaison with the Egyptian authorities and to work out what was going on and to connect with the tourists who were still in the area. And I spoke Arabic, and therefore I volunteered to do it. And that was the first security crisis or crisis of that kind I was involved in.
And that attitude that you just described, that ability to kind of detach slightly, was there then? Or given that it was the first time, it must have been an appalling scene to find yourself in the middle of, just from an emotional perspective. But you were able, even in that first instance, to be able to kind of separate yourself, if you like.
I think so, and I think the way if I look back, I think the way I handled it was by really focusing on everyone else. You've got some people who are really badly frightened, and later on, the parents of a young woman who was killed in the attack came out. And of course, you've got you mentioned ego earlier. I think one of the key things in those circumstances is to take your own ego out of it and to you really recognise that actually. The victims are the people you're dealing with. You're not a victim yourself. Your job is to help them, and to maintain calm and confidence, and be willing to absorb all of their anxieties and the anger that people feel in those circumstances, without raising the temperature by allowing your own emotions to move up the scale as well. And so I guess I just did that at that time, and I don't know how skillfully I managed it, but that's the way I responded to that. It felt like the right thing to do, and I guess it's felt like the right way to approach things since.
But there's nothing that you sort of identified in your past, in your upbringing, in the sort of, I don't know what mum and dad did for a living, or what family life was like as a much younger man. But have you tried to sort of trace back this? You've not described it as ability. I will, but this attitude that you have towards moments of drama. Have you been able to kind of trace that back at all and find a connection or not?
I haven't really tried, to be honest. I'm not one of the most reflective people. I tend to live my life forwards rather than looking back. So I just don't know. I had a very normal upbringing. Went to the village primary school, the local school in the local town. My father was a local businessman. My mother was a medical secretary. So there's nothing in my family background that naturally put me into this world. It's it's not as if I come from an army background or anything of that kind. So I don't know really. And of course, you don't know how you're going to react until you face it anyway.
That's the other truth of crisis, exactly. So Iraq, you're there with a UN badge on, so to speak, looking for weapons of mass destruction, or at least looking for evidence of mass destruction. And you find yourself confronted by Saddam Hussein's bodyguards, and a gun is waved in your face. A very different type of crisis How did you approach that one, Mark?
Well, that again is where just staying really, really calm. And we were in a team, and some of the people, including some with a military background around me, different nationalities and so on, were reacting quite emotionally. And there was just, I could see the situation getting out of control. Voices were beginning to be raised. Didn't help that that there was a language barrier, but people weren't waiting for the translators and so on. And that's just people operating under stress. And again, I felt I suppose one rationalizes these things in retrospect. You don't think about it at the time, but I was deliberately trying to stay calm, and not least because the young soldier who was at least pointing a gun at me, but the whole group of them around us were clearly very frightened themselves. Not of us; we weren't armed, but of the consequences for them if they got it wrong.
Yeah,
and just trying to calm them down, speak slowly. As I said, I spoke Arabic. So I was able to do some of the talking, and just speaking slowly and calmly, and just trying to explain to them that we didn't pose a threat, and if they wanted us to back off, we'd back off. That's how I responded in the moment, to try and take the heat out of the situation. And there's I remember watching I think it was an advert for the army actually, which showed an incident where tempers were getting very high. It was obviously reconstructed, but tempers were getting very high. I think in an insurgent situation. I think in Africa, if I remember rightly. And they showed the soldier taking his sunglasses off, and immediately the situation calmed down. And that image has always stuck in my mind. That being able to connect eye to eye, the guy having taken his sunglasses off, showing that he wasn't posing a threat, wasn't trying to impose his ego, his adrenaline, etc., on the other guy, took the heat out of it. And I always thought that was a great advert for the way that the British military can operate.
Your life was also in danger, although you didn't appreciate it at the time when you were the Deputy High Commissioner in Pakistan. You find yourself in an event in the Himalayas, I think, where you discover after the event, if I've got this right, that there was a bomb under your seat, a bomb not intended for you, for someone else, but that could easily have claimed your life. Just tell us a little bit about that. And I mean, and obviously there's an example of a crisis that actually you in the moment, of course, you had no idea, but afterwards you're told this. How did you react?
I think, very philosophically, really. This was at this extraordinary cultural event, essentially a polo match between two neighbouring villages. Polo is not an elite sport in that part of Pakistan. It's very much a village sport at something like 13,000 feet up in the foothills of the Himalayas, between neighbouring villages, and we'd essentially stumbled across it. We were travelling. My wife and I were travelling there on an official visit, and stumbled across it, and they invited us to stay for the match, and we happened, remarkable coincidence, to come across Michael Palin and his team, who were filming their Himalaya series at the time, and so we still have a photo of me and Michael Palin sitting watching this polo match. So in some ways,
not actually in the seat.
So he wasn't in the seat; he was in the neighbouring seat, we think. But of course, that would have been a much bigger story had he been hurt by it. And we sort of found out later that it was there. In a sense, there were so many security threats at that time. In Pakistan, we'd evacuated the mission a couple of times because of terrorist attacks, as had others. It didn't really register, and it almost just became an anecdote.
Yeah, I mean, in 2009, 2010, you're in Kabul as our man in Afghanistan. I suppose if there's a capital city of crisis, Kabul is definitely on the list. Are you drawn to these places? I mean, is there a part of you? I talked about this with Jeremy Bowen, who has spent so much of his professional life as a sort of crisis volunteer, if you like, inserting himself into these terribly dangerous environments. Is there a bit of you that has that?
Oh yeah, and no, I mean, unquestionably, I think I have to recognise that I've never done a diplomatic posting really anywhere away from some kind of a crisis. Never been posted to Paris or Washington or Brussels or any of these places. So that kind of challenge, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Syria, Egypt, even Cyprus, which was under huge pressure at the time. And actually there was even the threat of military action at the time I was there. So yes, I've always been drawn to that. I enjoy operating in that kind of environment. And part of it is that one has the opportunity to make an impact. As the British ambassador in Afghanistan, you can have a real influence on events, but it was certainly at that time it was possible to do so when the military campaign was at its peak, and the Brits had the second largest deployment of foreign troops after the Americans. Huge aid program, huge counter-narcotics program, all the rest of it. There was a real opportunity to have an impact in a way that a diplomat operating in a European or North American capital city is essentially just an observer. And so having the opportunity to be involved and roll my sleeves up and have dust on my boots is the kind of work that I'd always wanted to do.
Bit more than that, though, isn't it, Mark? Isn't it also the risk?
Yeah, there's a bit of that. I just hope my family aren't listening to this podcast. But of course there is a bit of that. Yeah, I do. You mentioned adrenaline earlier. I wouldn't describe myself as an adrenaline junkie, but I do enjoy risk. I learned to skydive, I ski, I scuba dive. All of those sorts of sports appeal to me, and I guess I've chosen areas to go where one has that heightened experience of being at the sharp end.
You were a Royal Marines Reserve, right?
Yeah, for a brief period when I was at university and shortly afterwards. Yeah, before I went overseas for the first time.
So, in terms of the future, what is it? You've been tipped as a potential Secretary General of NATO. Huge job that will not be without its elements of crisis as well, I'm sure. When you look to the future, what happens next? What's on the list? What's in your mind? The NATO job would be a fantastic role for you.
Yeah, that would be a remarkable opportunity, and to even be considered credible for it as someone who isn't a politician, hasn't been a minister, when all of the Secretary Generals, at least except the first, have been, is very flattering, and I'm grateful that people think I might be credible for it. Who knows what will happen? You know how these things are, Andy. There's a lot of water to go under the bridge before that job becomes available. Jens Stoltenberg, who's a friend and who is doing a brilliant job in my view, has done a brilliant job, has got another 18 months or more to run. So we'll see whether
invariably goes to a politician, though, doesn't it? The job.
Yeah, it always has. Except for the first one, who was a Brit. Yeah, it's always been a politician. So yeah, I'm entirely philosophical. As I say, I'm flattered that people consider that I might be credible for it. And if the opportunity arose, as I joked on another interview, picking up a phrase someone else might have used, if the ball came loose at the back of the scrum, of course. I would.
It's copyrighted, that one, Mark. It's copyrighted.
Of course, I'd be interested.
Oh, but, very good.
Aside from that, who knows? But aside from that, I'm actually enjoying trying a different style of life, putting together a portfolio of different activities, some in the private sector, some with charities, still doing some government work and chairing a G7 panel and the Atlantic Future Forum, which is a security conference that we've established in the UK using the aircraft carriers as the venue, and I'm enjoying putting that jigsaw together. And it's a different way of operating to having a sort of full-time public service career. But I've got another couple of decades of active working life to go, and I'm really enjoying trying a different theme.
Well, unfortunately, we don't get a vote on Secretary General of NATO. But if we did, you could count on mine. And I suspect that a fair number of people who listen to this podcast would also put their cross in the box. Look, I just want to say thank you, Mark, for talking to us today in the way that you have. I think it's been an incredibly useful conversation for anyone who is involved with crisis management, who's trying to kind of navigate, a significant problem, and you've navigated the most serious, in a way that was, that put public service first and foremost, and the national interest right there, and so thank you for that. But I'd like to finish by asking you for your crisis cures, if I may. These are three things that you've lent on, three specific things, not another person, that you've lent on in the difficult moments. What comes to mind when I ask you?
Pizza would be the first, and actually, there's a serious point behind that. I know it's a serious question, but actually, one of the things that you really have to try and do is keep people going, and often in a crisis. People are really keen to be involved, want to do their best, recognise the responsibility, and they can tire themselves out.
You've got to tell us what pizza you order when you're in number 10.
Well, we always got a variety. I like a Diavolo myself, but we would always get a variety so people could get their teeth into it.
It's that risk thing again, isn't it?
But there's just I know it sounds a bit flippant, but there is a serious point there.
Yeah.
Just doing some of the small things that mean that you're making sure people are getting enough sleep, enough food, enough rest. They're able to bring the best of themselves. You're giving them permission to take time off and maintain their own resilience is really important. And so I sort of, when I think of that point, I think of pizza, because that's a way of just kind of capturing it.
And the second?
Second, remember you've got two ears and one mouth. And there's a reason for that. And so slow down, listen, make sure that you're not only just listening, but listening actively, making sure that you're encouraging the quieter voices, those who are less likely to speak up and less encouraged, that you're getting all of those inputs, and that you don't jump, even under pressure of events and the need to react swiftly, you don't jump to conclusions more quickly than you have to. That sometimes you have to go just a bit slower to go faster, because if you go faster if you get it right, and then the decision can follow and be implemented, and that's all part of staying calm.
Yeah.
But just forcing oneself just to listen, just to make sure that everyone's had their chance to add their perspective as you're making a decision is really important. And then of course you expect everyone to, once the decision's made, to get on with it. And I think the third thing, this comes back to a point you were making earlier, is in any crisis, you put it in the political context, but in any crisis, communication isn't just explaining what you're doing, it's part of managing the crisis. And therefore, you've got to put communication, whether it's inside the system or out to the public or up to the political level, whatever it might be, has got to be absolutely central to what you're doing. And actually, if you're explaining what you're doing, you're making better decisions usually. Yeah. And so don't forget that communication is part of a crisis. It's not just an annoying afterthought where you sort of try and figure out what the media line is. It's absolutely central to the way you approach it.
Mark, thank you. That's absolutely superb. And thanks again for your time today for what I think has been, from a crisis perspective, an absolutely invaluable conversation.
Thank you very much.
Great stuff. This podcast was an absolute masterclass in crisis management. Although the stage Mark Sedwill has operated on is national, at times global, the lessons apply, I think, to anyone trying to navigate a proper problem. Mark is a man who found himself dealing with two of the biggest government crises of modern times, Brexit and, of course, the pandemic. But it was his previous roles across government, the military, UN, and intelligence, not that he would talk about that, of course, that provided the muscle memory for him to step up when those big tests came in number 10. His approach, in essence, was powerful in its simplicity. In crisis, communicate more, not less. Communication is the core of crisis management. Make sure everyone understands their job, including you. Don't try and play every position on the pitch. Understand that staying calm is contagious. How you behave and the words you use will impact how others behave. And remember that when you're talking or shouting, you're not learning. Sometimes the quietest person in the room has the best point to make. Mark was also clear that in crisis, you must leave room for error, including your own. His admission that his analytical approach can sometimes mean he lacks empathy was revealing. But as Mark says, you won't get everything right, but when those mistakes happen, recognize them, make sure that you've absorbed them, if you like, and then move on. As I say, an episode packed with useful takeaways from a man whose career has been dedicated to public service at the sharp end. Thanks for listening to Crisis What Crisis. Feel free to send us your feedback. You'll find our contact details and our show notes giving you the key insights from our guests at crisiswhatcrisis.com. There are also links to our newsletter, Facebook page and Instagram. There are more useful conversations on the way soon, and if you enjoyed this podcast, please do give us a rating and a review. Thanks again.